26 arrows. That's how many were pulled from the body of a single cavalry trooper after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He didn't die quickly, and his remains, along with thousands of other relics scattered across the Montana hillside, tell a very different story than the one most people have heard about Custer's last stand. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led over 200 men of the 7th Cavalry into what would become one of the most famous military disasters in American history. They rode into a massive village of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors along the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. Within hours, Custer and every man under his immediate command lay dead. The battlefield was remote, miles from any settlement. After the fighting ended, the bodies of soldiers and their horses were left where they fell. It would be over a year before a proper burial detail arrived. By then, the Montana weather and scavengers had done their work, but scattered across the grass and sagebrush were thousands of objects, weapons, ammunition, personal effects, equipment, each one a silent witness to what really happened that day. One of the most chilling discoveries came years later. Someone found a cavalry boot standing upright in the dirt, still containing the bones of a trooper's foot. The leather had preserved itself just long enough to hold its grim contents in place, as if the soldier had simply vanished from inside it. That boot became one of hundreds of relics that settlers, curiosity seekers, and early tourists began collecting from the site before anyone thought to stop them. The weapons tell the most important story. Historians recovered dozens of Springfield trapdoor carbines, the standard issue rifle for cavalry troops. These single-shot weapons had a critical flaw. Under rapid fire, the copper cartridge casings would expand from heat and jam in the breech, rendering the rifle useless. Troopers carried pocket knives specifically to pry out stuck casings. Multiple knives found on the battlefield showed clear marks of desperate attempts to clear jammed weapons during the fight. Meanwhile, many Native American warriors carried repeating rifles, Winchester and Henry models that could fire multiple rounds without reloading. The technological advantage clearly wasn't on Custer's side. A Colt 1860 model revolver was discovered in 1935, half buried in the riverbank. This older pistol was already outdated by 1876 standards. The cavalry carried newer Colt single-action Army revolvers. The presence of this older weapon suggests it likely belonged to a native warrior who had acquired it years earlier, possibly in trade or from a previous conflict. It had been lying in that riverbank for nearly 60 years before someone spotted the weathered grip protruding from the mud. Arrow points made from trade metal, obsidian, and flint were scattered everywhere across the battlefield. The arrow evidence reveals something historians rarely mention. Many soldiers survived the initial fighting only to be killed afterward. The sheer concentration of arrows in certain locations indicates that wounded troopers became targets for multiple warriors. These weren't clean, quick deaths. They were prolonged and brutal. Horse bones covered the battlefield for years. Photographs from 1877 show Last Stand Hill still littered with skeletal remains of cavalry mounts. These bones were eventually gathered up and placed inside the base of the monument erected at the site. Horseshoes, bits, pieces of saddles, and leather tack remained scattered for decades. Some were collected and buried. Others were taken as souvenirs by early visitors who had no concept of preserving a historic site. The battlefield became a tourist attraction surprisingly quickly. By the 1880s, people were already making pilgrimages to the site. They walked the ridges where men had died and took whatever they could carry. Spent cartridge cases, uniform buttons, pieces of equipment. This looting went on for years before anyone thought to protect the area. By the time it became a national monument, countless artifacts had already disappeared into private collections across the country. In the 1980s and 1990s, modern archaeological surveys using metal detectors finally began mapping the battlefield scientifically. Researchers found over 2,000 artifacts still in place. The locations of cartridge cases revealed exactly where soldiers had made their stands and how they moved during the fight. The distribution of spent rounds showed that native warriors had outflanked and surrounded the cavalry positions, firing from multiple directions. Physical evidence confirmed what the warrior accounts had been saying all along. One Springfield carbine recovered in the 1950s had been kept by a Sioux family for over 70 years. Family oral history said it had been taken from a dead soldier during the battle. The rifle still bore the inspector's marks and unit designation from when it was issued to the 7th Cavalry. That weapon had traveled from an armory in the east, across the plains to Montana, into the hands of a doomed trooper, and finally into native possession, where it remained for 3 generations. The relics from Little Bighorn aren't just old objects. They're tangible connections to one of the most significant cultural collisions in American history. Every rusted carbine, every arrowhead, every corroded button represents a human being who was there that day. Some were professional soldiers following orders. Others were warriors defending their families and way of life. The objects they left behind don't take sides. They simply exist as proof of what happened on those Montana hills. Today, the Little Bighorn battlefield is carefully preserved. No one's allowed to take anything anymore. But for decades, people walked off with pieces of history in their pockets. Some of those relics have made their way to museums. Many more sit in attics and display cases, family heirlooms with stories attached. Each one is a fragment of a day when the American frontier collided with itself. These relics reveal how ordinary the objects were. Penknives, horseshoes, buttons, the everyday equipment of men who had no idea they were riding toward death.